Humayun was an interesting emperor. He came to the throne after his father had ruled for only 4 years, and he wasn't really very well suited for kingship. He was a very sensitive gentleman who was very interested in astronomy. He was very interested in the invention of architectural creations. For example, he invented a floating building that consisted of 4 barges that somehow came together to form some arches. Well, exactly how this worked, we're not really sure. As a warrior, he wasn't consistent. That is, for example, in 1538, when the usurper Sher Shah Sur had pursued him, and he had actually been victorious in a battle against Sher Shah. He then spent the next 6 months in pleasure in the palace he had captured, when Sher Shah cleverly went on to control the rest of eastern India. So he wasn't very sensible in a lot of ways, but he did try to sustain an empire. He was ousted from India for a period of time, and in some ways, this ousting, where he spent a period of time in the Safavid court in Tabriz in Iran, turned out to be perhaps one of the most culturally significant events for the future of Mughal India, in that he brought back extremely talented artists from the Safavid court, the master artists, and then ensconced them in the Mughal atelier, which made a big difference in what was going to happen. As the audience might know, Humayun ruled for 10 years. He was then, as I said, sort of basically kicked out of India. And then he came back for 1 year. And he unfortunately, after ruling for only 1 year after his return, died in an accident. Well, the tomb was constructed sometime between about 1568 and 71, something around then. And it wasn't constructed immediately because the Mughal Empire wasn't really an empire. It was a series of very unconsolidated territories that Akbar had to really shape up and gel into a coherent state. So he was very preoccupied with military enterprise. So that probably was one reason for the delay. We don't really know exactly who constructed it. Humayun's senior wife, Haji Begum, is often credited with the construction. She probably had a role. We don't have any sources that really tell us this. But since the tomb was very likely intended as a dynastic mausoleum for the Mughals, it probably had Akbar's hand in it very heavily. We know that he hired architects from Bukhara, today in Uzbekistan. That would have been part of the Timurid homeland, which, and of course, the Mughals are really Timurids. They're an extension of the great Timurid dynasty. And they were a father and son team who were trained in both landscape architecture and building architecture, probably getting these 2 gentlemen from Uzbekistan probably took some time. And of course, the tomb is enormous, so that would take a long time to build. And it was unique at that time in the Indian subcontinent. So again, that would probably explain some of the reasons in the delay of building. Well, we don't really know the role that Haji Begum played in the construction of this particular tomb, but we know that Akbar, who was probably the overall patron, was in fact he quite revered the senior women in his life. For example, we know that he gave his mother the governorship of Delhi when he was out of town. Now, it perhaps was more of an honorific role than actually sitting down and figuring out the taxes and the revenue and all that sort of thing. But the fact is that these women, the senior women of the court, had considerable responsibilities. And so we think, for example, of Nur Jahan as being unique in having a lot of authority. Well, she probably had more authority than any previous woman. She's actually following a pattern of Mughal women being responsible. And by the time of Shah Jahan, for example, it's the high-ranking women of the court, his various wives, princesses, his daughters, so on and so forth, who are actually responsible for embellishing the city with mosques. He, of course, built the large mosque, the Jami Mosque, but the other mosques, for example, the Akbari Mosque, which is no longer in existence, or the Fatehpuri Mosque, or the Zinat al-Manazil, all of those were built by senior women or important women of the court. So we have a long-standing pattern of important female roles. It doesn't mean that Haji Begum was responsible for directing people personally, but rather that she was the overseer and probably was the overseer in many ways. So that again is something I think that's worth thinking about. Humayun's tomb is a very, as you know, large complex, and it was built in an enormous garden. The location is very important. It was built at the site associated with India's ancient epic lore, events associated with the Mahabharata, known as Indraprastha, so that it had an ancient Indic meaning. It was also built in very close proximity to the shrine of Nizamuddin Auliya, who at this point I think is Delhi's most important saint, a saint of the Chishti order, the Chishti Silsila, which basically will become the saintly lineage that kind of underwrites Mughal legitimacy and Mughal authority. It's also located at the site of the first of Akbar's capital, that is Din Pana, started by Humayun, intervened by Sher Shah, and then again resided by Akbar in his very early days before he shifted his court down to Agra. So it has its location has important associations with Indic tradition, with Muslim tradition, and with Mughal authority. So the design of the tomb is heavily inspired from the Central Asian Timurid tradition. That is, it's set in what's known as a charbagh, a four-part garden. Four-part gardens are an Iranian, a very long-standing Iranian tradition. They probably date back to Sasanian times, that is, or even perhaps to Achaemenid times, that is, pre-Islamic Iranian associations. They're often associated with the notion of paradise, that is, the gardens that are promised to the faithful in the Islamic tradition on the Day of Judgment. But under Babur, the first Mughal, these very ordered, regular four-part gardens were associated with order and with Babur's ability to rule India. He likened himself to a master gardener, and he saw his ability to make gardens as sort of a metaphor for his ability to rule what he considered to be unruly India. So the garden setting itself has a symbolic meaning. The tomb, which was at the time that it was built, was the largest tomb in the entire subcontinent, perhaps one of the largest tombs really in the Muslim world at that point. It sits on a very high plinth, and it then is what is called a Baghdadi octagon. That is an octagon whose sides vary. They're of irregular size. That is, one side will be smaller in width and the next one larger. And so it's in what's called an irregular octagon, and this is, again, from the Central Asian tradition. The interior of Indian tombs to date had been just a single central chamber. Humayun's tomb differs in that it has a central chamber, and then around it are 8 ancillary rooms, which can be circumambulated in a slightly awkward way. This tomb type is known as a Hasht Bahisht, or an 8 paradise type tomb, and it again derives from Timurid tomb types. So the plan is a type that is really intended to be kind of, again, a metaphor for paradise. That is obviously the land that's promised to, or the promise to the faithful on the Day of Judgment. The tomb has 2 upper floors, and we know that the roof was used as a madrasa, that is a teaching institution. The tomb is, as anyone who looks at it can see, is largely red sandstone. This sandstone comes from the area around Dholpur in Rajasthan. And it's faced with white marble trim, the marble, of course, coming from the Aravalli Hills in the area of Rajasthan down to Gujarat, but probably from Rajasthan itself. Now, this basically becomes the imperial Mughal building type. And as Ebba Kalk has pointed out, the colors probably were chosen very specifically. I mean, not only was the stone available, but other color stones were available as well. And in the ancient Indic tradition, white is associated with the colors of Brahmins, that is, of knowledge and learning. And red, which is the majority of the building, is associated with Kshatriyas, and that is the kingly caste. And so you can imagine that the Mughals saw the use of red on imperial architecture as really an assertion of their royal authority. So we can see the tomb as being really, obviously, a very grand expression of royal authority, but also a kind of a setting that indicates order, but also the notion of paradise. Today the tomb is planted with grass, which is basically a British kind of invention. Grass would not have been a natural ground covering in South Asia. And we don't know exactly how any of these tombs, including the Taj Mahal, was planted, but we have reason to believe from paintings and from some references in literary sources that flowers that would bloom at various times of the year, as well as trees, including cypress, for example, which are often in Persian poetry a metaphor for the lover and the beloved, which in the Persian Sufi tradition, or the mystic tradition, is basically a metaphor for the love of the divine, the love of God, the yearning for God. It also would have planted with fruit trees, and we know that the fruit would be sold, and that the income that the fruit would bring in would help support the mausoleum. You know, today the river is quite far away from the tomb, but the Jamuna has shifted course, and that in the time of its construction, that is the sort of latter half of the first half of or the second, I mean in the middle, let's say really more the middle of the 16th century, that the Jamuna ran right next to the tomb. So the Jamuna obviously was feeding the wells that were watering the garden, that were supporting the tomb. There are wells that are still extant. Behind a south entrance gate into the tomb complex is a very large well that actually still functions, that feeds the water. It's been restored recently by the Aga Khan, and so today now water is actually coming down from the water chutes into many of the canals that run through the garden, which produce a very, very nice effect. So the tomb in design is inspired from Timurid types. Now again, this is not an accident because, as I mentioned earlier, the Mughals considered themselves Timurids. I have a feeling they'd be quite as shocked if they knew that they were called Mughals. They're also descended from the Mongols, but they really, truly sort of more clung to their Timurid legacy. And so they're called Moguls or Mughals, which is really just a corruption of Mongol. So the Timurid building type was also intended to showcase their Timurid legacy. The tomb was probably not intended just to inter Humayun, but probably was also intended to ultimately inter the future Mughal rulers. Of course, this didn't really happen. A separate tomb for the next several rulers were built, one for each of them. And in Humayun's tomb, there are many other graves, other tombs. Many of them are in the chambers that are in the plinth below. But interestingly, many of these people are the more disgraced members of the Mughal house. Now, why this happens, nobody's sure. But it did not end up being a dynastic tomb. Islamic tombs in India perhaps were set in gardens. We don't really know. But if they were, they probably were fairly simple. It was very unlikely that they had water courses running through them, or even if they did, that they were these very regular ordered charbags. Tombs in India until the construction of Humayun's tomb, and even many of them after them, tended to be either fairly simple square plan tombs. Many, for example, tombs of the Lodis, that is the dynasty that preceded the Mughals, were square plan tombs, and most of those tombs were built for nobility. The tombs of kings in the Lodi and that slightly earlier period, the Sayyid period, usually were octagonal tombs, but they were nowhere as sophisticated in plan as was Humayun's tomb. There you find a single central chamber with a veranda that would be around it. An example is, for example, two of the tombs in Lodi Gardens, the tomb of Sikandar Shah or the tomb of Mubarak Shah, which are easily seen by people. Before that, the tombs were, in general, even more simple. As I said, they tended to be square plan tombs with a single chamber. It was not until Humayun's tomb that the notion of constructing a very enormous tomb in a planned garden setting really became the norm for the Mughal elite. Just before the construction of Humayun's tomb, there had been the construction of Sher Shah's tomb in Sasaram. That is the same person that had basically ousted Humayun from India. His tomb, until that point, had been the largest one in the Indian subcontinent. It was a very large version of the octagonal type that I talked about in terms of Sikandar Lodi's tomb, for example. And the tomb of Sher Shah uniquely was set in a very large pool of water that was probably intended to evoke, again, the waters of paradise. But even so, while that tomb is very impressive, it again lacks the links with the Timurid architecture of Central Asia, and nor does it have the very sophisticated or elegant stone facing on the tomb. It's really stucco. And Humayun's tomb really stands out as a fairly unique construction. It becomes, of course, the model for the Taj Mahal. And that is, I think, because Humayun's tomb, more than any other one, is very much modeled on those Timurid prototypes. And Shah Jahan, of course, was extremely proud of his Timurid legacy. And so there's an intentional evocation of that earlier tomb. Humayun's tomb was set, of course, in proximity to the tomb of Nizamuddin Auliya, this very important 14th century Chishti saint who became deeply revered. And it's also really close to the then Mughal fort, what we call today the Purana Kila, which had been called the Din Pana, or the Refuge of Religion, by Humayun, who first commenced it. It was set on, must have been open ground at that time, right next to the river Jamuna. And it was, as I said, planned so that it would be linked to the palace, the walled palace, to the tomb. So in a sense, because of the Mathura road today that runs between the Humayun's tomb and the Dargah, the complex of Nizamuddin Auliya, we tend to think of them as very separate sort of areas. But in the Mughal time, I think we would probably think of them as being more of an extension of one another. Also, slightly to the north of Humayun's tomb, there was originally a huge sarai that is a place for travelers to stop. The Grand Trunk Road was still there, what we call the Mathura Road today. But there was also a huge sarai, as I mentioned, which would have been a stopping point for travelers. And we can imagine that not only were they replenishing themselves with food, water, whatever, the people didn't drink tea in those days. Probably many of them stopped off to pay homage to the tomb of Nizamuddin Auliya. And it's unclear how accessible these grand Mughal tombs were to the public. It's believed now that probably they were opened sometimes to the public, at least their gardens were. But certainly whether they were open or not, the huge tomb could be seen over the walls. And it would be understood that the deceased emperor, Humayun, was receiving the baraka, that is the kind of spiritual essence that exudes from a saint's tomb, from Nizamuddin Auliya. So he'd be seen increasingly as a kingly figure who was really endowed with the saint's grace. So I think that's how it would have been perceived in the middle of the 16th century and afterwards, when the tomb had been built and was seen by the general public who was traveling on the GT road, what we call it Mathura Road today, as they traversed from one. Saints' tombs we know were circumambulated. People still do this today. In general, they're circumambulated 7 times, and this is the same rite that's given at the Kaaba in Mecca, that is the holiest shrine in Islam. This is done at the tombs of many Sufi saints. So the circumambulation of the tombs, of the Mughal tombs by the Mughal elite, indicate a concept of kingship that was basically commenced under Abul Fazl, that is the great Mughal minister's sort of inspiration, implementation of his concept of Akbar's authority. That is the notion that Mughal rulers are basically semi-divine, that they come from a long line whose original sort of source or human what had been conceived by a princess who was impregnated with a ray of divine light. So this notion of circumambulating the tomb gives the Mughal emperor basically, it underscores his semi-divine status. It gives him a status that's superior to mere mortals. The fact that two architects from the Timurid homeland were procured to build the tomb. The fact that it is so huge in scale, so monumental. The fact that it was very carefully planned suggests that there's some degree of imperial authority. We have no way of knowing if Akbar personally showed up at the work site and told the workmen what to do. I mean, he was pretty busy trying to consolidate Indian states and authorities, so I'm sure that he had a supervisor doing all this. But certainly it wasn't left to just whim. I mean, certainly there's a high degree, I'd say, of imperial intervention in the tomb. Definitely, I would say that there are indigenous influences in the tomb. One certainly is this reference to color, the notion that in Indic texts, ancient Indian texts, red is the color of the warrior caste Kshatriyas, and white the color associated with Brahmins, that is the priestly group. So that certainly would be an indigenous Indic effect. I think the very fact that it was built on a site associated with Indraprastha, that is the site associated with events in the Mahabharata, the great Indian epic, certainly was it. And it was well known in India. Even 14th century texts talk about this land site as being associated with Indraprastha. So this is not something that we people in the 21st century say, oh, well, you know, we know it was associated with Indraprastha. The Mughals were fully aware of this. And those are certainly some of the Indic associations that we have. The fact that it's octagonal also may be a reference to earlier kings. I think its size, which is larger than Sher Shah's tomb, was again intended to evoke past rulers, but also to suggest that the Mughals were the logical extension, the new rulers. While Akbar at this time, very early in his reign, was concerned with his Central Asian origins, increasingly over time, of course, he becomes deeply interested in things Indic. So this is by far the most Central Asian-inspired building that is constructed under Akbar. Subsequent ones, including the Agra Fort, which is his next major project, and really sort of basically started just about the time that Humayun's tomb is starting to be completed, is extraordinarily Indic in nature with its post and lintel architecture. Many people call it Hindu. That's not correct because this sort of architecture had been used widely under the sultanates, especially in Gujarat, in Western India. So I prefer to call that a pan-Indian style architecture, not one that's associated with any religious affiliation. We actually have no record of who the craftspeople were, but I'm going to speculate a bit, and that is that Mughal architecture before the construction of Humayun's tomb was not terribly sophisticated. By and large, for example, if we take the Babur's mosque at Panipat, or if we, which is where he defeated the last Lodi Sultan in 1526, or Humayun's mosque in Agra, which is across the river from the Taj, they seem to be fairly unsophisticated attempts to emulate Timurid architecture, but it would seem that there was a lack of people highly skilled in the engineering techniques that would be needed, the technology that would be needed to actually build those kind of buildings. There's a complete transformation with the construction of Humayun's tomb, which suggests that probably the two architects, Syed Miraghis and his son, who came, as I said, from Bukhara in Central Asia, to design and work on Humayun's tomb, I imagine they brought technicians with them, because all of a sudden we have the kind of vaulting and the kind of planning that were only found in Central Asia and Iran. So there must be a conflation of Indian stonemasons, because in Central Asia there's very little stone, so it's almost all stucco or brick construction, combined with engineers and technicians who knew how to build in Central Asian techniques. But we don't have any names, we don't have any texts that tell us this, but looking at the building and how it appears would suggest that sort of thing. Mughal architecture, of course, is quite interesting, and I think I'm going to just stick to tomb construction, because if I started talking about palaces and other things, we'd be here for a long time. So in its role, in its sort of place in tomb construction, obviously it's the first really major Mughal tomb. Babur's tomb had been built in Kabul in Afghanistan, and it's very simple. So the next two great Mughal tombs, which would be Akbar's tomb and the tomb of Jahangir, of course are somewhat similar to Humayun's tomb. The garden settings are there, and that's very important. They both sit on very large plinths. Akbar's tomb is tiered, and its top floor is open to the sky, probably to receive the moon and sunlight. And of course, Akbar was very interested in the notion of divine light. Jahangir's tomb today in Lahore, Pakistan, today it's just a simple plinth with 4 huge minarets, which of course Humayun's tomb doesn't have. It too originally had an open air plinth on top, which is now missing. And then we have Shah Jahan's tomb, Shah Jahan's tomb, the Taj Mahal, which was of course built for his wife, but also interrs the ruler himself, and I believe was always intended to inter Shah Jahan. It is very much modeled on Humayun's tomb. In part, I believe, because both of those tombs are intended to evoke the Timurid past, to underscore the Mughals' Timurid legacy. The Taj, of course, has a huge minaret on each corner of the plinth, which was something we saw at Jahangir's tomb. So Humayun's tomb is very important, of course, in terms of the garden setting, which we find in multiple Mughal tombs, whether they're imperial or sub-imperial, and the huge plinth. And then, of course, later tombs like Safdar Jung's tomb, other Mughal tombs are, of course, many of them are irregular octagons, that is Baghdadi octagons, including the Taj with a dome on top. So it was very important, at least through the next 100 years, in sort of establishing a mode of what it, of what it is to have a grand tomb. So it's, yeah, it had a lot of importance. Humayun's tomb and the Taj Mahal have more in common than any of the other great Mughal tombs. So one, obviously, is the garden setting, although the Taj's is more oblong in shape. And of course, the Taj has another garden on the other side of the river, which Humayun's tomb lacks. They both have these monumental plinths. They both are irregular octagons, that is Baghdadi octagons. The Taj has a minaret at each corner of the plinth, which Humayun's tomb does not have. They both, of course, have large domes on top. Of course, one of the major differences is the facing of each of the tombs. Humayun's tomb is the use of red and white, red sandstone and white marble. And Shah Jahan's tomb is completely faced with white marble. Increasingly, what we see is the use of white marble for the imperial presence. In the time of Akbar, who was the patron, basically, of Humayun's tomb, we had white marble that was used for the trim of tombs, and we talked earlier about how that may have indicated a notion of education, of priestly learning. But white marble was reserved for the tombs of saints. For example, the tomb in Ajmer of Sheikh Muinuddin Chishti, or the tomb of Sheikh Salim Chishti at Fatehpur Sikri, for example. And it was also used for the Mughal thrones. For example, the throne of Akbar at, we know from paintings at the Agra fort. It was then, of course, replaced by Shah Jahan's white marble throne. So over time, we have a transference from the use of white marble only for saints' tombs to the use of white marble for imperial tombs. That is Shah Jahan's tomb, the Taj Mahal, which was, as I said earlier, not only intended for his wife, but for himself as well. So this really underscores this transition that we have from the Mughals thinking of themselves as rulers, in the case of Babur, to thinking of themselves as semi-divine rulers, which you start getting with Akbar later in his rule, with Jahangir, and then, of course, with Shah Jahan. So, again, this is a reflection of notions of kingship. It's not just decoration. On the outside of Humayun's tombs, well, not really on the outside, as you go through several doorways, massive doorways that have gardens within them to get to the actual tomb of Humayun. One of the first ones that you have off to the side is the tomb of Isa Khan. He was an important noble under the Sur kings. And so, again, his tomb was placed there before Humayun's, obviously. And again, he's being placed in close proximity to the Chishti saint Nizamuddin Auliya. He's being placed there to receive the saint's baraka, his saintly aura. Okay, so then once inside of Humayun's tomb, there's the tomb that's called the tomb of the barber. It's very unlikely that it was a tomb of a barber. It was probably some very elite person. We don't know who it was. There's tombs around in the complex. And then, of course, there's all the graves inside the tomb. Some of them are the graves of the princely families. Some of them are much later Mughal princes that are buried in the cells within the plinth. There were probably many more graves than we have today. There is a tendency to remove many of the graves, especially the ones that are sort of falling apart. The tomb probably was an extension, basically, of the Dargah, of the shrine of Nizamuddin Auliya, which of course has the graves of Shah Jahan's daughter, Jahan Ara, the graves of some of the later Mughals, and many of the elite. So probably what we think of today as a division between Nizamuddin and East and West, that division that we think of wasn't there. So it probably would have been really, in some ways, a vast graveyard, a vast Qabristan, basically, that we would have had in that area. The Aga Khan Foundation became engaged with the government of India in restoring not only Humayun's tomb, but also the basti of Nizamuddin. And they made a Mughal type garden to the north of the tomb, pretty much in the area where the original great Mughal Sarai had been earlier. Some of that extends into the area where the zoo is today, and they're hoping to work there, but they haven't been able to do that yet. So the project that dealt with the basti included the clearing of the Bauli at Nizamuddin's tomb, and actually doing enormously wonderful social projects at the basti, including medical facilities, education, the constructions of playgrounds, so on and so forth. At the tomb, there was a great effort to restore it to its original place in time. So the waterways were cleared, and not all of the canals are full of water, but certainly some of the main ones are, giving a sense of how the tomb would have looked originally. The cement that had been put on in much of on much of the tomb during restoration in earlier periods was all removed. It was removed by hand. Then the original stucco work was restored, the tile work was restored, and what was so good about this project was that the Aga Khan Foundation actually taught local people how to do this, so that it gave them employment and also trained them to do restoration on other important monuments of India, of Delhi. The tomb of Humayun, which of course has always been a major tourist attraction for, of course, foreigners and Indians alike, as well as a place of enjoyment for the locals who live there. It was always it was always a really impressive structure, no one can deny that. But I think it's been brought back to much of its original splendor and glory by this restoration project. And one of the things I always, always feel about this restoration project, that it wasn't just a project that had to do with the improvement of the appearance of a monument, but really engaged the local people, improving their daily lives, but also giving them an income. And I think that's a really important way to think about projects, combining them with social needs as well as aesthetic improvements and implications. So it's been an important project. I think we know a lot about the basic tomb, about how, I think we know as much as we're going to know about how it was constructed, who constructed it, so on and so forth. Probably if there's an opportunity to explore more about its Central Asian roots, that might be a good project. It might be interesting to have a dialogue between scholars trained in Central Asian scholarship with scholars trained in Indic traditions, to see really how much is Indic and how much is Central Asian. I find that when you talk to people who come out of the Central Asian tradition, they often have a very different point of view, and I think that's something that could really well be explored and studied at this point. I think the tomb is a very exciting monument. I think it's one of the highlights of Delhi, maybe the highlight of Delhi, especially since it has been restored so beautifully by the Aga Khan people. And one of the things that really interested me was that when I used to go to Humayun's tomb, there were people there. There were often tour groups and what have you. But increasingly, I'm seeing a lot of local people who are there. And especially I'm seeing people who are of Muslim origin, who I think are really connecting with their own heritage, of course, as well as Indians from multiple cultural and religious traditions. And I think that by having this monument restored and by having people come to it and appreciate it is just one way to help ensure the maintenance of India's cultural traditions, which I think all of us worry about a great deal sometimes, because of course people need basic things like food and water, but also it's really important to remember the past, and what a great thing it really is. So I think the tomb really is important for all of that. When you enter the tomb today, basically from the Mathura roadside, this is not necessarily the way that the great Mughals would have entered it. They probably came down from the river. We know, for example, this is the way that Shah Jahan personally visited the Taj Mahal. He did not enter in through the gate that would be the street side, the way people enter today. The great Mughals would have entered on the east side of the tomb. We enter today on the west side. The west side often appears flat, because what you have is you're entering through what's called the Qibla side, the side of the tomb that faces in the direction of Mecca. And there's an arch there which does not hold an entrance. Rather, it holds a small sandstone arch which is pierced with holes. It has jollies, that is, it has netting in it. And that is actually the tomb's mihrab, that is the tomb's prayer niche. It indicates the direction towards which Muslims pray. That prayer niche, that mihrab, which is full of holes, would allow for the entrance of light. And that very specifically evokes a particular verse in the Quran, which likens God's presence to light in a niche. So you're seeing it really from the backside when you come in as a visitor to the Taj. The other three sides, the east side, the north side, and the south side, have great recessed niches with entrances. And those great recessed niches are what are really coming out of the Central Asian tradition. So while obviously many people who would visit the tomb, even in the Mughal time, were coming in from what was then the Grand Trunk Road, from the great Sarai that was near it, the Mughals themselves would have come in through the river, on the river entrance, which of course now has shifted very far away, and there's train tracks now there today. So you have to, again, know the context so you can understand how it really would have been imagined and seen. It's difficult to know exactly how everything at Humayun's tomb was used. The gardens certainly would have been very beautiful, that you would have seen them from the plinth below. We have Mughal paintings that suggest that people enjoyed gatherings in gardens. very possibly this happened at Humayun's tomb, probably for the Urs, that is the annual commemoration of Humayun's death. There would have been many celebrations that would have involved music, probably the precursor of what we call Qawwali today. There would have been 24-hour recitations of the Quran. They probably would have gone on in those many arched cells that are in the plinth, in the bottom part of the plinth. We don't have texts that tell us this, but we know this is how later tombs were used. So we can imagine that this is what happened at Humayun's tomb as well. The entrance gates would have had room for people to gather. They could have been cooled by the water tumbling down the chudders or the water chutes. Those water chutes are carved with a zigzag pattern, which makes the water look like it's rushing faster than it really is. So visually, you would have felt that you were almost near a little waterfall. And of course, this was an attempt to recreate the natural waterfalls that would be found in the mountains of Central Asia when the snow that was melting was rushing down. Or even, let's say, in Kashmir, in the gardens of Kashmir, when the snow melts and it turns into rushing water from the natural streams. Certainly during the Urs, the tomb would be circumambulated. It is impossible to know at this point whether the general public was allowed to come in and participate in these events or whether it was limited to a certain level of the nobility. We really don't know that. But the tomb would be used. Of course, as the Mughals shifted their capital from Delhi almost immediately by the time the tomb was finished, and didn't return to Delhi as a residence until the middle of the 17th century. It probably was visited sporadically. Well, we know it was visited sporadically by the elite, but we know that it was maintained, and that I'm sure that those who were in charge of Delhi, the governors of Delhi, were probably using the tomb in some manner. It's hard to believe that it wasn't actually being used, given its location by the tomb of Nizamuddin Auliya and by the huge sarai, and right off this major thoroughway, a place that linked Agra to Delhi to Lahore, along with other important cities.